Aaliyah endured constant bullying from her racist teacher. Yet what the teacher remained unaware of was that Aaliyah's father was the principal. Witness how this struggle for power within the classroom culminates in an unexpected twist you won't anticipate. Additionally, please share where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. The bell echoed through Brierwood High's corridors, its piercing sound bouncing off the shiny floors and stretching down the lengthy hallways. Students rushed to their classrooms, the sound of sneakers shuffling and quiet conversations filling the atmosphere. However, room 306 had a different vibe, electric, almost expectant. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front, her stance unyielding, her face wearing her usual stern demeanor. Her eyes scanned the room, silently assessing her students as they hurried to their seats. The walls behind her were adorned with neatly arranged literary posters featuring famous quotes from Shakespeare, Austen, and Hemingway. The whiteboard shone behind her, immaculate except for the date written in her sharp, angular handwriting. Mrs. Thompson commanded attention with her presence. An unspoken rule existed in her classroom: never challenge her authority. Over the years, she built a reputation as a teacher who tolerated no nonsense. Her lectures were precise, her rules non-negotiable, and her punishments swift. Few students dared to oppose her, and those who did quickly regretted it. The room settled into its usual rhythm as students entered. Books were placed on desks, notebooks opened, pens ready, yet there was a subtle undercurrent of something different today. A faint buzz of curiosity simmering beneath the surface, like a quiet hum on the verge of becoming louder. This subtle change became evident when someone entered the doorway moments later: Aaliyah Williams. Her entrance was quiet and unassuming, yet it captured everyone's attention nonetheless. She paused at the threshold, her backpack casually slung over one shoulder, dark curls neatly tied back in a ponytail. Her caramel-toned skin shimmered under the bright fluorescent lights, and her eyes swiftly took in the room, meeting the unfamiliar stares of her new classmates. Whispers began almost instantly. "Who's that? Is she new here? Where did she transfer from?" The whispering intensified as Aaliyah fully stepped into the room, her movements soft but purposeful. Mrs. Thompson's keen eyes immediately fixed on her, a tight, thin smile curling her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and she slightly tilted her chin as if gearing up for a confrontation. "Well, well," Mrs. Thompson's voice pierced through the murmurs, silencing them instantly. "It appears we have a new member in our class today." Her tone dripped with insincere warmth, sending shivers down Aaliyah's spine. The students shifted in their seats, their gazes oscillating between Aaliyah and the teacher, eager to see how this interaction would unfold. Aaliyah stood confidently, resisting the urge to fidget under Mrs. Thompson's icy scrutiny. Her heart raced, but her expression remained composed. She had learned early that showing vulnerability in such situations only provided others with more leverage. And Mrs. Thompson, with her piercing eyes and strained smile, seemed like someone who thrived on that leverage. "I hope," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice slicing through the silence, "that you can keep up with our demanding curriculum." The term demanding lingered in the air, heavy with sarcasm. A brief pause followed, a tense moment stretching between them. It was evident from Mrs. Thompson's barely noticeable lip twitch that she had already judged Aaliyah, labeling her as yet another student unlikely to meet her extraordinarily high standards. But Aaliyah was no stranger to judgment. She had faced it before, both subtly and overtly. Raised eyebrows as she entered a room, quiet whispers assuming she wasn't paying attention, lowered expectations based on her skin color. She felt Mrs. Thompson's assumptions weighing down on her, but she had long since learned to stand strong beneath them. "I'll do my best," Aaliyah responded softly, her voice carrying strength. She met Mrs. Thompson's gaze, refusing to avert her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, something like surprise flickered in the teacher's eyes before it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Good," Mrs. Thompson replied, her forced smile still in place. "You may take your seat." The room's tension thickened as Aaliyah walked to an empty desk at the back. All eyes followed her, tracking her every move. She felt the curiosity burning against her back, but she maintained her composure, her steps steady. She had grown accustomed to being the new girl, standing out among familiar faces. It no longer fazed her. As she settled into her seat, the whispers resumed, low and cautious, like the beginnings of a brewing storm. Aaliyah didn't need to hear the words to understand their meaning. She had heard it all before. Where do you think she's from? Do you think she'll survive in this class? I bet Mrs. Thompson will break her down. Mrs. Thompson turned to the whiteboard, the squeak of her marker breaking the silence. Now, she stated, regaining her usual brisk no-nonsense tone, let's begin. Aaliyah opened her notebook, her eyes scanning the room as she listened to Mrs. Thompson start the day's lesson. The teacher's voice faded into the background as Aaliyah's thoughts drifted, her heart still pounding a bit too fast. She had dealt with teachers like Mrs. Thompson before, teachers who underestimated her, saw her skin color before her intellect, and assumed she couldn't keep up. But this time felt different. This wasn't just another classroom or another school. Something about Mrs. Thompson's gaze, the way her voice dripped with fake sweetness, told Aaliyah that this would be a battle unlike any she had faced before. And she wasn't sure who would come out on top. As the class continued, the air in room 306 remained thick with unspoken tension. Aaliyah kept her head down, taking notes, but her mind was racing. This wasn't going to be an ordinary day. And something told her that this wasn't going to be an ordinary school year either. The soft murmur of students flipping through pages and scribbling notes filled the room as Mrs. Thompson stood rigid at the front. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks. Behind Mrs. Thompson, the whiteboard was blank except for 3 words in her angular handwriting. To kill a mockingbird. Today, Mrs. Thompson began, her voice sharp and authoritative, we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in this great American novel. Her words were crisp and calculated, as if she had rehearsed them countless times. She paced slowly in front of the board, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor, a steady, rhythmic reminder of her dominance in the room. Aaliyah sat at the back, her pencil poised over her notebook. Her mind buzzed with thoughts. She had read To Kill a Mockingbird several times, each reading revealing new layers and insights. The themes of racism and moral courage weren't just abstract ideas to her, they were real lived experiences. Mrs. Thompson's voice droned on, but Aaliyah's thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the book's deeper message. To her, the story wasn't just about Tom Robinson's trial, it was about the bystanders, the ways society allows injustice to fester. Power and oppression, Mrs. Thompson repeated, glancing around the room. What does the book teach us about these themes? Can anyone share their thoughts? Aaliyah's hand shot up almost instinctively. She had been waiting for this moment, eager to contribute and share her perspective. She felt a spark of excitement, certain she had something valuable to add to the discussion. But Mrs. Thompson's gaze passed right over her, as if Aaliyah's hand was invisible. Instead, she pointed to the front row. Michael, she called out, her tone softening slightly. What do you think? Michael cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, looking down at his notes. I think the book is about how people in power can, control others who are less powerful, he mumbled. His voice was flat, his response rehearsed and lacking conviction, but Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good, she said, her voice clipped. Yes, exactly. Power dynamics play a significant role in the novel. Anyone else? Aaliyah kept her hand raised, her heart sinking as Mrs. Thompson called on another student. This time it was Laura, a soft-spoken girl who recited something from the textbook verbatim. Mrs. Thompson responded with another curt nod, her expression unchanged. The responses were shallow, surface-level observations that barely scratched the surface of the text. Aaliyah's frustration began to simmer, but she maintained her composure, determined to wait her turn. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Thompson's eyes finally landed on Aaliyah. The teacher's smile was tight, her body language tense, as if acknowledging Aaliyah's presence was an obligation she couldn't avoid. "Yes, Ms. Williams," she said, her voice sharper than before. "Do you have something to add?" Aaliyah straightened in her seat, feeling her classmates' eyes on her, some curious, others indifferent. The weight of their gazes pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. She had thought deeply about this and was ready to share. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism is deeply embedded in—" Before Aaliyah could finish, Mrs. Thompson's hand shot up, silencing her. The teacher's smile vanished, replaced with impatience. "Systemic racism?" she echoed, her voice laced with mockery. "This is a classic American novel, Ms. Williams, not some modern political commentary." The words landed with a dull thud, their impact rippling through the room. A ripple of unease passed as several students shifted in their seats. Some glanced at Aaliyah with wide eyes, while others looked down, pretending not to notice the growing tension. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. Heat rose to her cheeks, and her chest tightened. She felt the stares and judgment, but wasn't about to back down. She had faced this before, the dismissive tone, the subtle undermining of her intelligence. But she wouldn't let herself be silenced, not this time. "With all due respect, Mrs. Thompson," Aaliyah began again, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. "The book clearly addresses racial injustice through the trial of Tom Robinson. It's a reflection of—" "Enough," Mrs. Thompson snapped, turning her back on Aaliyah as she moved toward the whiteboard. "Focus on the text as it is, Miss Williams, not how you wish it to be. We're here to analyze the author's intentions, not to impose our own modern interpretations." The classroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. Aaliyah's hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, her nails digging into her palms. She felt her classmates' eyes burning into her skin, but none spoke. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Some students exchanged awkward glances, while others sat rigidly, eyes fixed on their desks. A few, those who had smirked at Mrs. Thompson's earlier remarks, seemed to relish the teacher's condescension, quietly amused by Aaliyah's isolation. Aaliyah struggled to keep her breathing steady, refusing to let frustration show. She had come to this classroom to learn, not to be silenced. But how could she learn when the person meant to educate her had already dismissed her voice? She glanced around, searching for a flicker of solidarity, someone willing to meet her eyes. But most students avoided her gaze, lost in their own thoughts. A few, like Sarah in the front row, gave her a small, apologetic glance, but it wasn't enough. The message was clear: Aaliyah was alone. Mrs. Thompson continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, scribbling a few words on the board in quick, precise strokes. "Now, let's discuss the symbolism of the mockingbird. Who can explain what it represents?" Aaliyah's fists relaxed, her fingers now cold against the smooth desk surface. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus, to not let Mrs. Thompson's dismissal rattle her. But the teacher's words echoed in her mind. "Focus on the text as it is, not how you wish it to be." What did that even mean? Was Mrs. Thompson implying that Aaliyah's understanding of the novel, its deep racial wounds, was irrelevant? Was she saying those themes didn't matter anymore, that they were relics of the past? Aaliyah's mind swirled with anger and confusion, but above all, she felt a deep, gnawing sense of injustice. She looked down at her notebook, her carefully written notes suddenly feeling insignificant. Her thoughts raced too fast to concentrate. Mrs. Thompson's words stung in a way Aaliyah hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about being ignored in a classroom discussion. It was about being told, yet again, that her experiences and insights didn't belong. But she couldn't give in to that. She wouldn't. As the class continued, Aaliyah quietly raised her hand again. Her voice wouldn't be silenced, not today. But Mrs. Thompson never looked her way. Days at Brierwood High began to blend together, each feeling like a slow march through an endless battleground. For Aaliyah, every moment in room 306 was a silent war, one she hadn't chosen but was determined to endure. Mrs. Thompson's icy demeanor and cutting remarks had become a constant, a relentless force pressing down on her day after day. The rest of the class had grown accustomed to the quiet conflict between their teacher and the new girl. It was as if an unspoken agreement had settled: don't get involved, don't take sides. Some watched with quiet sympathy, others with growing indifference, but no one dared to speak up. The classroom's atmosphere was thick, the tension only intensifying with each passing day. Aaliyah kept her head down, focusing on her notes, trying to avoid drawing Mrs. Thompson's attention. But no matter how hard she tried to blend into the background, the teacher's sharp gaze always seemed to find her. Every time Aaliyah raised her hand, Mrs. Thompson would look past her, calling on someone else with a dismissive flick of her eyes. When Aaliyah did manage to speak, Mrs. Thompson would cut her off mid-sentence, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. It was as if Aaliyah's thoughts and words didn't matter, like she didn't belong in that room. But Aaliyah refused to crumble under Mrs. Thompson's disdain. She kept attending class, kept raising her hand, kept speaking up, even when her voice was ignored, even when it felt like the entire room was closing in on her. Her silent resistance was her way of fighting back, even if no one else noticed. One afternoon, the classroom buzzed with the low hum of students working on their essays. The clicking of pens, the rustling of paper, the occasional cough or whispered conversation filled the room. Mrs. Thompson prowled the aisles, her eyes scanning the rows of students with hawk-like precision. Aaliyah sat near the back, her head bent over her notebook, her pen moving steadily as she jotted down her thoughts. The lesson that day had been on character development, and Aaliyah had immersed herself in her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird. Her notes were meticulous, her thoughts clear, but she knew it didn't matter. No matter how hard she worked, Mrs. Thompson had already formed her opinion of her. A sudden voice pierced the quiet, harsh, and accusatory. "Ms. Williams." Aaliyah's head snapped up, her pen freezing mid-sentence. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room, her eyes locked on Aaliyah with cold precision. "Are you chewing gum?" The question hung in the air like a slap, drawing the entire class's attention. Heads turned toward Aaliyah, eyes wide with curiosity and anticipation. Aaliyah blinked, momentarily thrown off. "No, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady but confused. She hadn't been chewing anything. Her lips were dry, her mouth empty. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a thin, disbelieving line. "Don't lie to me, young lady," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I can see you chewing from all the way up here. Spit it out." The room fell into a deathly silence. A few students exchanged glances, their faces a mix of amusement and discomfort. Some sat rigidly, not daring to move, while others watched with morbid fascination, eager to see what would happen next. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Aaliyah felt the heat rise in her chest but forced herself to stay calm. She had learned long ago that reacting, giving in to anger or frustration, would only make things worse. Instead, she stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, and walked toward the trash can at the front of the room. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step a reminder that she was alone in this battle. Reaching the trash can, she mimed spitting out the imaginary gum, her hand brushing her lips in a motion that felt both absurd and humiliating. The class watched in stunned silence, some smirking behind their hands, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Aaliyah's face burned, not from shame but from the injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, performing a pointless act just to satisfy Mrs. Thompson's need for control. It wasn't about the gum. It was never about the gum. It was about power. Mrs. Thompson wanted to remind her once again who held authority in this room. As Aaliyah returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of Sarah in the front row. The quiet girl's eyes were filled with something like sympathy, a fleeting acknowledgement of the unfairness that had just occurred. But Sarah said nothing, her gaze quickly dropping to the desk in front of her. No one spoke. Aaliyah returned to her seat, her fists clenched tightly beneath the desk. She could sense her classmates' eyes fixed on her, the burden of their silent approval pressing down like a tangible force. Yet she refused to let it overwhelm her. Instead, she picked up her pen and resumed writing, her fingers gripping it so firmly her knuckles turned white. Minutes passed, and the room's usual quiet murmur gradually settled back into its typical low hum. Mrs. Thompson had shifted her focus to another student, but the weight of that moment lingered, dense and oppressive. Aaliyah's mind was a whirlwind of frustration, anger, and something deeper, something that teetered dangerously close to surrender. However, she couldn't succumb to that feeling. Not in this moment. She forced herself to concentrate on her notes, on the task before her. Her pen danced across the page, but her thoughts replayed the incident repeatedly in her mind. How many more times would she face this? How many more minor humiliations would she have to bear before things changed? A fleeting thought crossed her mind. What if I just stopped trying? Or what if I gave up? But she quickly dismissed it. Giving up wasn't an option. She had to persevere, to continue fighting, even if it felt like she was alone in this struggle. As the bell rang, marking the end of class, Aaliyah slowly packed her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She refused to show Mrs. Thompson any sign of weakness, any hint that her words and actions had shaken her. She would keep attending, keep raising her hand, keep voicing her thoughts, even if no one paid attention. Upon leaving the classroom, Aaliyah felt the weight of Sarah's glance, a silent apology reflected in her slightly slumped shoulders. Yet once again no words were exchanged. The conflict between Aaliyah and Mrs. Thompson wasn't loud or overt. It was quiet, subtle, an invisible battle fought through stolen glances, interrupted sentences, and small, biting moments of embarrassment. But Aaliyah was certain of one thing: she wouldn't stop fighting. Not yet. The awaited day had finally arrived, the day Aaliyah had both dreaded and meticulously prepared for. Group project presentations had been looming over her for weeks, a dark cloud on the horizon. She knew from the beginning that this was the moment Mrs. Thompson had been waiting for, a chance to dismantle her, to humiliate her in front of the entire class. Aaliyah could feel it in her bones. Seated at her desk, Aaliyah reviewed her notes one last time. She had worked tirelessly on her presentation, diving into books, research papers, and scholarly articles late into the night. Her project focused on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage in To Kill a Mockingbird, a topic she chose not only because it resonated with her personally, but also because it was central to the novel's essence. She ensured every point was supported by evidence, every argument grounded in textual analysis. She was ready, or as ready as she could be. But now, none of that seemed to matter. As Mrs. Thompson called her name, Aaliyah stood, the eyes of her classmates following her every move. The tension in the room was thick, heavy, as if everyone anticipated the inevitable clash. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced herself to walk steadily to the front, her notes clutched tightly in her hand. Mrs. Thompson stood at the side of the classroom, arms crossed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She resembled a predator watching its prey, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Taking a deep breath, Aaliyah began her presentation, her voice calm yet strong. To Kill a Mockingbird, she started, is a novel that delves into the deeply ingrained racial injustice in the American South during the 1930s. Through Tom Robinson's trial, Harper Lee examines how systemic racism impacts not only individuals but entire communities. Her words were clear and well organized, but as she spoke she felt Mrs. Thompson's gaze intensify, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Aaliyah pressed on, determined to complete her presentation without faltering. She discussed the moral courage of characters like Atticus Finch, the symbolism of the mockingbird representing innocence destroyed by prejudice, and how Tom Robinson's trial exposed the harsh realities of racial inequality. As Aaliyah continued, she noticed Mrs. Thompson's smile tighten, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. It was a subtle shift, but Aaliyah could feel its weight. She had seen this look before, the look of someone poised to pounce at the right moment. Midway through the presentation, Mrs. Thompson raised her hand. Aaliyah froze for a split second, her heart skipping a beat. The room, which had been quiet until then, seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson?" Aaliyah asked, striving to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Thompson's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the smile of someone who had eagerly awaited this moment. "Ms. Williams," she began sweetly, her tone dripping with false politeness, "don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel? Shouldn't you concentrate on the broader literary merits instead of fixating on racial themes?" Her words were like a knife, sharp and precise. A ripple of unease spread through the classroom. A few students exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Aaliyah and Mrs. Thompson. Others remained still, unsure of how to react. The air was thick with tension, pressing down from all sides. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she stayed composed. This was exactly what she had anticipated. She knew Mrs. Thompson would attempt to discredit her, to undermine her argument before the entire class. But anticipating it didn't make it any easier. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Aaliyah responded, "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the novel, Mrs. Thompson. Harper Lee intended the trial of Tom Robinson to highlight the deep-rooted racial inequalities." Mrs. Thompson cut her off, her smile fading as her eyes hardened. "Perhaps," she interrupted sharply, "you should dedicate less time to personal agendas and more to critical analysis. This novel is about far more than just race." Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the sting of Mrs. Thompson's words like a slap across her face. A gasp rippled through the room as students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ensuing silence was suffocating, as if the entire class awaited Aaliyah's next move. Her fists clenched beneath the desk, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to suppress the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She refused to let tears fall. Not here, not in front of Mrs. Thompson, not in front of the class. She knew this wasn't merely about the book. It wasn't just about To Kill a Mockingbird. It was about something much deeper, about power, about who controlled the narrative, about whose voice was deemed valid and whose wasn't. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in her mind, personal agendas, critical analysis, overemphasizing. What Mrs. Thompson was truly conveying was that Aaliyah's perspective didn't matter, that her lived experiences and insights were somehow less valid because they focused on race, that her voice was too loud, too insistent, too inconvenient. Aaliyah took a slow, deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She wouldn't give Mrs. Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Not today." "I respectfully disagree," Aaliyah said, her voice quieter yet steady. "The racial themes are integral to the story, and ignoring them would be ignoring the very heart of the novel." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The smile was gone, replaced by something colder and more calculating. She was losing control of the situation, and Aaliyah could see it. The teacher's next words were clipped and sharp as knives. "Ms. Williams," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice rising slightly, "perhaps you should take a moment to reflect on whether you truly understand the broader context of this novel. This class values academic rigor, and I'm afraid your analysis seems limited." The room fell silent once more. Some students stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Others glanced nervously at Aaliyah, unsure of how to respond. It was clear now that this wasn't just about academic criticism, it was personal, a power play. Aaliyah swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between two choices: stand her ground or let the weight of Mrs. Thompson's authority push her over. But deep down, Aaliyah knew she couldn't back down. Not now. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let this moment break her. With a calm she didn't entirely feel, Aaliyah met Mrs. Thompson's gaze. "I'll continue to refine my analysis, Mrs. Thompson. But I stand by my interpretation. To Kill a Mockingbird is, at its core, a story about race, and I believe it's important to acknowledge that." Mrs. Thompson's jaw tightened, her frustration evident. For a brief moment, the two stood locked in a silent standoff, the tension between them thick and electric. It was a battle of wills, a clash between authority and resistance, and the entire class could feel it. Finally, Mrs. Thompson let out a small, tight laugh. "Very well, Ms. Williams," she said coldly. "You may continue." But the damage had already been done. As Aaliyah turned back to her notes, her heart still racing, she knew this was far from over. Mrs. Thompson had made it clear. This was a fight for control, and she wasn't going to let Aaliyah win easily. As Aaliyah continued her presentation, her voice steady but her heart heavy, she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She was fighting a battle much bigger than herself, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold her ground. The room remained thick with tension, every eye glued to Aaliyah as she stood at the front. Her presentation had ended, but the battle between her and Mrs. Thompson was far from over. The air was heavy with the unsaid and the unspoken. Aaliyah could still feel the sting of Mrs. Thompson's thinly veiled insults, her dismissal of Aaliyah's hard work and intellect. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the classroom door creaked open. Heads turned as the door swung wide, and in walked a tall, imposing figure. Mr. Williams, the school principal, entered the room with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. His tailored suit, crisp and dark, spoke of professionalism and power, and the steady sound of his polished shoes echoed in the sudden silence. A ripple of recognition passed through the students. Some